Hey, look out. It's Faith Talk Live. I'm Rick Probst.
And I'm Dan Ratcliffe.
He's back. It is Gary Bates there. And we just saw his very, very important associate, Fran, kind of adjusting him and
Adjusting
helping
him.
the
That's
IT
right. Yeah.
department.
Adjusting him by the
Gary
neck, I think is what she was doing.
Gary from Creation Ministry. How you doing, buddy?
I'm good. You know, Fran is one of our senior events planners. We speak in about 330 churches a year. And so she gets the privilege of not only telling me where to go at home, but also at work.
That is so funny.
And you being a dutiful husband, you do what she tells you, right?
Well, she says you might be the CEO, but you still get to take out the trash on Friday nights. So.
But you know, you wouldn't have it any other way. You know that.
No, absolutely not. In fact, this year we've been married 40 years this year.
Wow. Congratulations.
Yeah,
Congratulations.
It's
Gary,
just been a piece of cake, as you know, guys. It's
Oh, yes, it is.
So.
Yeah.
Yeah. Marriage is about the easiest thing you can do.
Yep. Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, we thanks so much for the opportunity to catch up with you. You're one busy guy, and rightly so, with all the things that are going on in your world. I think the last time we talked about vaccines, etc. This time, we'd like to talk a little bit about the genetic and
Easy for you to say.
Entropy.
The breakdown of the
There you go.
genome. How about that? Let's put it in middle school terms there for me.
Yeah, that's kind of related to even what we talk about with vaccines, because we're talking about genes mutating and affecting the human species, you know, with the coronavirus. And this is kind of an extension of that. This is what's happening in the real world, and not only to humans, but every single organism that's been studied. It's basically the de-evolution of the genome. That's what's going on.
Now, just real quick, give a definition. I had to go back and just kind of dig, because during biology class and any science class, I either took a nap or I was skipping school. So I had to go back and just kind of refresh my knowledge on DNA, genome, mutations, and stuff like that. And it's fascinating because we know that our cells are made up, and there's a genome, basically a picture of our system, right? And the genetics is breaking down. Evolutionists believe that we're getting better, but that's not the case. And you want to talk about that? Let's do it.
Well, you've hit the nail on the head. You know, the theory that organisms change from kind of one kind into another, as popularized by Darwin, you know, some 150 years later. Microbiology today is more like information technology. So just as an explanation, I can say that creatures do change, but what we're going to hear and find out is that, you know, dogs change into different kinds of dogs, and horses change into different kinds of horses. But, you know, a pansy is not going to become a professor. Microbe's not going to become a microbiologist. And everything we now see in the real world points in the opposite direction to what evolutionists believe. So a bit of a biology lesson. All creatures, all living organisms, and ourselves, we have a computer storage system. Let's call it that. The DNA molecule. It's a chemical molecule. And within that, in human beings, for example, if we were to just type out the letters of information, there are 4 letters, GCAT, and it's the combination of the letters that create the information. So if you pick up a book and you see letters organized on a page into words and sentences, it's meaningful information because it's an information code. And you're programmed to understand that code. If I scramble the letters in the book, the information is meaningless.
Yeah.
So in human beings, we have about 3 billion letters in our DNA. That's like amassing 1,000 Bibles on top of one another. And all the letters in that 1,000 Bibles worth of information have to be just in the right spot to tell the cells to build a human being, what shade of skin you're going to have, hair shade, eye shade, and so on. Now, the genome is the library. A gene, if you like, is a sentence in that library, okay? And so we can look at it in a way using that analogy, you know, libraries, sentences, words. And we're still obviously finding out what all of this does. Now, when fertilization, conception takes place in humans. You probably remember this from the biology classes, at least, Rick. We get one set of instructions from dad, and we get one set of instructions from mum, right?
Yeah, right.
So that's why we inherit some of their features. Some of those genes, might be dominant or not, and that'll cause us to inherit traits. But what we found out is that in our genes, we get something known as mutations. So just imagine if I took a photocopy of a piece of paper and I went onto the studio photocopier, and when I photocopied it, one letter got corrupted as a result of the copying process. You could call that a mutation. But then I take that photocopied paper and I photocopy it again, and I'm now getting another mutation, another mistake. And every time I do that on the copying machine, I'm going to multiply the mutations.
That's good.
Now, there's a couple of things happening here. We have 3 billion letters. So taking a biblical time frame of about 6,000 years ago with Adam and Eve, we understand we were channeled through 8 people, Noah and his descendants at the flood. Creationists have made statistical and computer models that show that when we look at the level of corruption in our human genome, we're about what we would expect to be using the biblical time frame. And what I'm saying is that every generation of human beings, when we reproduce, we inherit about 50% of our parents' genetic mutations through their sexual reproduction cells, and each generation adds about 100 letter mistakes of our own. So I got all my parents got, kind of mutations from their parents, plus I added my own.
Yeah.
So actually every generation of human beings is becoming more mutant. Couple of things here. The evolutionary time frame says Homo sapiens, we first appeared, evolved from apes about 200,000 years ago. Well, if that is the case, the mutations would have built up so much in the human species that, we would be finding probably mutational defects, birth defects, reactions to medicines, foods in a much, much greater number than we're seeing now. I mean, in fact, we are starting to see that build up because of our decaying genome, but much, much less than the evolutionary time frame. So you can also use this like a genetic clock, if you like, to defy, one, the evolutionary predictions, and two, the evolutionary time frame of millions of years and the idea that humans have evolved from apes, etc. So this is called genetic entropy. And the first person to do real research on this is a Cornell professor by the name of Dr. John Sanford. He's a world famous scientist because he invented something called the gene gun. And the gene gun is where they take a gene from, a certain type of corn, injected into another type of corn or inserted into another type of corn to produce bountiful yields. It's called genetic modification, which is a bit of a scary concept for some people, but done under balanced controls, it actually does benefit us.
Yeah.
Wow. Talking to Gary Bates, the CEO of Creation Ministries. So what does this mean for us, Gary, with genetic entropy? If it is true, which the science is there, what does it mean for us and for our faith?
Well, every organism we've looked at is suffering entropy. We see mutations in the real world. So let me give you a good example of what people might understand as a big mutation. Let's say in Africa, an antelope is born with 3 legs. Okay, it's obviously due to a genetic, mutation that's caused this big morphological, in other words, physical change that we can see. Now, he's not going to survive very, very well in the African wilderness with 3 legs. So that mutation is going to get selected out pretty quick from the gene pool when he's, eaten by the lions.
Right.
But natural selection, which is real, it's not evolution. Evolutionists believe that natural selection plus mutations can give rise to new functions, new traits. Maybe can put legs on fish or something like that in a big picture sense. We don't see that. But natural selection cannot see just these individual letter mistakes because they're too small. It can select out a big change, but when you're only talking about a letter here and there, okay, that over time will build up, natural selection can't see them. So there's actually no way to select them out from the population. And that means even in the human species, there is actually no way to reverse them. Now, this is a pretty scary thing if you're not a Christian.
Right.
Because apart from Christ, there's actually no hope for the human race. In fact, and I said every organism, our biological world is actually running down, it's de-evolving. And of course, when we read the Bible, we know that our time on this earth and the earth itself is finite, because the Creator who made the heavens and earth in Genesis 1:1 says he's going to make a new heavens and earth. Why? Well, it's exactly this principle we're talking about. It's wearing out. You know, we read about that in Romans 8, for example, about the groaning and travailing of the creation before us. So this is an exciting discovery for creation scientists, but it's also a very, very sobering message for us, of course, because it immediately recognizes our fallen state, our inability to save ourselves, that apart from Christ, there is absolutely no hope at all. And, you know, we talked at the beginning about, you know, the COVID-19 virus. That is a mutation, obviously, where it looks like a virus that's come from a bat. And this happens all the time, these zoonotics, where a mutation, something that's changed in it, has actually given it the ability to transfer to the human species, etc. And that can also happen both ways as well. So the evolutionists have tried to argue strongly against this, but as I said at the beginning, you and I know when we look at dogs breed, we get dogs, and we can find mutated dogs, and people can even artificially select certain traits. They say, well, I like that little thing over there, you know, call it a Chihuahua. It's micro-sized, and I'm going to breed it with another small dog. And ultimately, we can produce a breed of dogs that is small, but we're losing genetic information in that process. We're losing the genetic instructions and the information for largeness. If we threw a truckload of dogs in Alaska and they ranged from short, medium to long fur, well, the long-furred dogs are going to have a survival advantage. They'll pass that information on to their offspring. The dogs with short and medium fur will get selected out, and you'll only have a population of dogs with long fur. And people say, look, creatures have changed, therefore evolution is true. But here's the kicker in that. Nature, and nature's not some conscious, you know, living entity that can think, but it's a convenient term we use, but it's selecting out animals, or the dogs with short and medium fur, that don't have a survival advantage, but it can only select from what's already available in the environment. Can you see that? There's nothing new being produced.
Yeah.
Right.
And so this is another indication of everything wound up. Everything was good in the beginning, lots of information, and it's getting selected out, weeded out, and of course through mutation as well, it's getting worse. And that's the big take-home message. So for anybody listening, if you don't know the Lord Jesus, this is something that we're looking at that is real, tangible in our biological world, that says ultimately the humankind is going to evolve out, de-evolve.
Yeah, that's so good. Gary Bates, you can go to creation.com and find out more about the genetic breakdown, mutations. It's just fascinating stuff. And there's so much more that we could talk about, but we do want to switch gears. By the way, you can follow Gary at creation.com. Not sure if he's traveling yet, but you can definitely see some streaming stuff, read some stuff, and hopefully when this is all said and done in 2021 or whenever, he'll be back on the road at a venue near you. Hey, Gary, let's do this. We talked a little bit about just the whole genetic breakdown. And as I mentioned, it is fascinating. Also, with the COVID-19 that's been going on, we have also a number of other things that are happening at the same time. It just seemed like everything exploded, and a part of that, piece of that is racism, and it's a very touchy subject. But we know, and this is what you say, that, and we believe it as well, that the answer to racism, period, is the Bible.
Yeah, that's a big statement. And I have to say, as a ministry, we usually are cautious about things that we say, because science is about things that you might learn tomorrow that you don't know today. But I really do believe that with my whole heart. The only answer to racism is the Bible, because right from the beginning, it tells us that humanity was created in God's image. We read in the book of Acts, long before we knew about DNA, of one blood, the King James says, the more modern translation says, of one man, he made all nations of men. And there's a lesson here, you see, because, sadly, Rick and Dan, my guys and myself, we go out into churches and people, I'm going to be stark here, have some horrible ideas that still somehow, black people have maybe come about differently, evolved differently. But even from a Christian point of view, they'll say, well, God created them on a different day. And unwittingly, when they say those types of things, they're saying that they're actually not descendants of Adam and therefore can't be saved. And our ministry fights vociferously against this, because we were just talking about our genes. And when we look at the DNA of human beings, and this is going to be a very shocking statistic for you, all humans, every single human being on this planet, I don't know whether they come from outer Mongolia, Alaska, or Southern Australia, we are 99.9% genetically similar. So we look at the human beings, we notice the differences in us, but I often say to children, notice what is alike. We've all got 2 arms, 2 eyes, 2 ears. The differences we have, which people call racial differences, are less than 0.1% of the library of our instructions, the genome. And all we're talking about in terms of what people think is skin color is skin shade. And the reason I say the Bible is the only answer, because, we're seeing all sorts of movements around the world. And I don't want to comment on the correctness of demonstrations or whatever. I mean, nobody should, these things unfortunately get hijacked and businesses get burnt, and no one would support that, I think, on either side.
Right.
But I would say that we do need to encourage the scientific basis and the biblical basis at the same time to help the church in this regard, that we are all human beings. And I think back to missionaries, 100 or 200 years ago, went to Africa. They didn't have the knowledge of DNA that we have today, but they made a stand on God's word, believing, they said, well, okay, we don't understand it, but these are human beings. Yes, they look different, but they are worthy of salvation because they are, made in God's image. Right. And that's why we took the gospel to nations around the world. But here's the kicker. There's an article on the front page of our website, which people can look up, and it's called Bronx Zoo Apologizes for Putting a Man in a Monkey Cage. Pretty provocative title. But this is the story of an African pygmy. He was just under 5 feet tall, Otabenga, who was taken by, and I've substantiated in the article, 5 investors, 5 people who owned the Bronx Zoo in New York. And he was originally put on display at the World's Fair in St. Louis with some of his countrymen. And then he was put in the monkey house, they called it, along with an orangutan, and cited as a missing link. Now, in July this year, the Bronx Zoo apologized for its racist actions. Well, rightly so, but nowhere did they cite the very reason they put that man on display. It was because of evolutionary beliefs. And there's no question about it. I'm not just taking a cheap shot here. evolutionists would have said to us in the day, hey, trust us, this is the new science. And the church started to adopt it and still adopts it today and wanted us to trust their science. Well, in the last session, we just spoke about how their science has got it wrong. And this is another example where their science got it wrong. Because to be frank here, and again, this is a sensitive subject, but when you think of all the racist taunts that our black brothers and sisters undergo, you know, when they get called monkeys and horrible things like this, why is that? There's an evolutionary basis to it, isn't it? That somehow that people are more ape-like and so on. And this needs to be done away with. So we can enshrine laws, we can be politically correct and do all of those things. But Dan and Rick, the only change is going to come when there's a heart change.
Mm-hmm.
When we realize that when we're looking at people, they are fellow human beings, part of God's creation, made in his image. And Jesus died as much for them, as much for an Asian, as for an Aboriginal, for an African American, for a pygmy that was put on display in a zoo. Christ died for them also. And until we undergo that heart change, you know, trying to get people to wrestle and adjust with laws that they don't necessarily understand or necessarily agree with for all sorts of reasons, cultural upbringing, background, and purely just their own prejudiced notions. But the science is on our side and the Bible is on our side. And, you know, we see statues being torn down around the world. But in fact, if there's one statue, let me be provocative here, we should pull down, is Charles Darwin's.
Yeah.
Because he was the one in his book. And if people look at that article on our website, in his second book, The Descent of Man, he actually wrote, and in our movie, people can look at it on creation.com and get it there, called The Voyage That Shook the World. We spoke with Darwin historians, and one of them, Peter Bowler, in Darwin's office at Cambridge in England, he actually admits, and he's an evolutionist, he says, by the time this book came out, Darwin was promoting the idea that the so-called black races were lower on the evolutionary scale and closer to the apes. Yeah. No one wants to hear stuff like that today, but I'm sorry, that's where the majority of these racist ideas have their origins.
Hey, Gary, we appreciate your time. We got to go to a break. We're running over just a bit. This is fascinating. We could do a whole show just about this. Let's do that. Seriously. It's so good. Creation.com. You see the website right there. Gary Bates. Hey, we'll be back. I'm Rick Probst.
And I'm Dan Ratcliffe.
This is Faith Talk Live.